Hello, my name is Billy Jackson, and I appreciate you taking the time to watch this today. I'm going to be briefly discussing my somewhat most recent creative practices. Talking about why I make what I make as an artist, and going through a little bit about my journey to get to where I am and potentially where I want to go. This image here that you can see is a photograph taken of me close to 10 years ago, I believe, from one of my dear friends from high school. This was back when I used to live with my parents, and we would always just hang out in the studio. Well, we called it a studio. It was really a spare bedroom, but we would hang out there, and as you can see, there's some sort of sock with paint, wooden clothes hanger, nailed to the wall, and who knows what we were doing back then, but it was a really good foundation for me as a young person and as a creative, I suppose. Here on the list, I have a few of the usernames in which I tend to create work under. Obviously, when my physicality is inherently involved, I go by Billy Jackson, which is my name or my given name. Rainbows, Hailbows, Angelic Mud, Casino Happy, Dev Butter, and Brainskew are all other usernames that I use for different reasons, or that all have maybe different personality traits, if you will. So I'm going to briefly talk about these usernames to begin with, and then we can start to see some of my work. So here we have kind of my very early foundation of video games. That's where Rainbows and Hailbows primarily stems from. Rainbows is my RuneScape account that I've spent many, many years playing through. At this point, I believe it's close to 20 years old as far as when it was originally created. And it has 350 days of playing time, roughly at the time of playing this. However, I believe it's amassed about 70 days on top of that since. And the other image there on the left, you can see is a screenshot from Hailbows, which is another one of my RuneScape accounts. That one is kind of more self-sufficient, so it does have a little bit of a different energy to it, and a different physical appearance and different stats, and in many ways is a different part of me. And on the right-hand side of this, you can see kind of some of my early game consoles, which was the Game Boy Color and the Nintendo GameCube. These were consoles that I owned at some point in my life when I was young. However, I did have experiences with video games, at neighbors' consoles, with things like that when I was younger prior to owning these myself. My next username that I go by, the next three actually were all kind of created at the same time. When I first started thinking about the idea, which I call digital realism, the idea was for me to split myself up into these kind of three different core pillars that all represented different aspects of myself. So Angelic Mud is more of the modest version of myself, a little bit more concerned and careful, and kind of stems from this kind of spirituality, and tends to be more respectful. Casino Happy is kind of my more impulsive or risky kind of username, if you will. Tends to be more careless and more primal, and tends to be more obsessed with creating things fast and being as prolific as possible. Dev Butter is by far the most aspirational of the three, in the sense of it's the one that I feel the least like in my current state. However, I like to include this one as part of my ambitions and also part of my goals of, becoming more intelligent and to learning more. Anyways, so Dev Butter tends to be more calculated, more analytical, precise, and efficient, and anything that tends to be very heavily technically associated with, such as when I write programs to create artwork with, or other things like that. That tends to be where Dev Butter shines the most bright. When I left high school, I already had, started to create art at that point for a few years throughout high school. But I wanted to kind of kick off my new life, if you will, post high school with a bang. So I decided to kind of take some of my paintings and put them onto clothing, which at the time was one of my passions. These images here are all part of a clothing drop, or a artwork drop, if you will, in which I believe I released maybe 14 or 15 unique, one-of-a-kind, wearable garments. And this was really fantastic for me because I really enjoyed utilizing artwork in personal expression, but also being able to present my artwork through my own wearing and through other people's wearing in the streets, and spawn conversations that I'm interested in with random strangers who just happen to see what you're wearing. From working with clothing so much, I ended up getting quite into styling and more on the fashion side of things, the commercial side of things. So here I've included a few images of some of my styling work that I did through my job at the time. My job was clothing oriented, so I worked with, digital web shops and through Instagram and social media and all these different things, and also through styling for merchandising and for visual images. And I found this to be a really great way for me to kind of understand, I suppose, what my visual creations end up portraying to the outside world. I think as an artist, it's very easy to be like, this is an orange that I painted, therefore I see it as an orange. But this, idea of me styling for other people's enjoyment really kind of got me thinking about, how the artwork or how my creations fall on other people. Here's some of my merchandising that I had done. I used to really enjoy doing this and looking through the store for different fabrics and garments, and sometimes even, using history as my reference point when it comes to brand origins and things of this nature. And I really enjoyed, kind of laying these out and creating these kind of unique compositions that, I felt like could almost be just, taken right off of the shelf and worn immediately. All the meanwhile I was doing this, I was really growing my body of illustration work. These images here that I've included are just a few of, hundreds and hundreds of drawings that I created over the years during this period. Many of which utilize this kind of form of figure, whether it be a stick figure or these almost kind of, people have told me they're almost Keith Haring-like figures. For me, really that's all they are, is figures, and they're just, vessels for me to represent different interaction points, different situations, and also convey different, emotional concepts. Simultaneously, I was also interested in the way that body and mannerisms can manifest, and was very interested in the idea of, movement and different positions that people can be in, and the idea of, this contorted person, this contorted being, is always very interesting to me. Here's some of the other work that, once again, people would probably say, I don't feel so, but they, represent these similar forms. But this is when my work started to get a little bit more narrative and, potentially conceptual. I would often think about these situations or these kind of abstract interactions, I suppose. And then I would think, okay, well, what is the most, basic or simple way for me to manifest this, into a drawing that conveys what I want. So here you can see, some sort of sheriff or officer shooting this kind of unarmed punching bag. You can also see this figure here that's kind of slumped over the wine glass, yet still wanting more, right? So these images are very simple, but there are ways that I could speak of things that I feel like are important, such as power, or gluttony, for example. At the same time, I did still like using color. However, even the works that ended up being in different mediums still, in my mind, still represented the same thing. On the left there, you can see Heroin, Bike, and Internal Happiness, and Dirty Blood. And this was stemmed from a situation that I had seen in real life, where there were syringes involved and a bicycle and, you know, an individual who was slumped over the bike, and they constantly were struggling to stand up, and then they would kind of fall back over into this void, and the bike would shift, and it, neither the bike nor the human ever fell or tipped over, but this kind of constant back and forth I wanted to represent. And also I felt like that specific interaction is very, I suppose, peculiar, but at the same time too synonymous with many people's experiences. So that's why I chose to represent it. On the right hand side, this is one that's maybe more probably be classified as surreal, I suppose. A little bit more intuitive and just kind of seeing what forms came out. But even still, in these kind of more abstract or surrealist expressions, you still often would see text being utilized. And that was something that I subconsciously did. I never realized that by including text with drawings, that the text itself becomes a part of the drawing. And that's something that in my current practice I explore a lot, in the use of text alongside images or even in supplement of images, is something that I find very interesting. As you can see here, these are some other kind of random examples utilizing text or visuals. And in many ways, this was kind of interesting because these works in particular, the text is actually driving the visual element. So for example, I was thinking about colors, and I was thinking about color palettes, and I was thinking about filth and mold and bruises and ash. And therefore, this kind of visual representation of me trying to figure out these colors or these palettes ended up creating an image that does have visuality to it, but is still inherently deriven from text. Same thing with this other situation here. This was drawn in my friend Jordan's garage, or shed rather. And I just wrote, working away at my favorite thing ever, because he was working at cars on his car, and I was working on my drawing. And I just wrote that. And then from that, I realized, okay, well, maybe I should, create this drawing that represents that, and I suppose in some sense you can kind of see, the original idea, and then also the culmination of that idea, in the same place, right beside each other. And I think that's something that I enjoy. Here, these are some works that, once again, go back onto clothing, because I was still working in that medium a lot at the time. And these are works that are almost purely about, sounds or words, and some of them don't even have any images at all. But yet, I still feel like these end up being graphic in some way. Obviously, some of them does have, the one on the right does have a painterly element to it. But the one on the left still has this kind of graphic quality, despite being just only words and I guess a little bit of design or layout. Now this is an image that I've included as part of me setting up for one of my first my early shows a long time ago. And some of these works, I don't believe ended up actually being hung, but I'm pretty sure that at the time of the actual show happening, I just kind of brought everything that I had with me. You can see on the right hand side this sort of crude looking map, and that's quite a large artwork that was the main focus of the event itself, in which the people who originally put the event on asked me to create some sort of visual representation of Victoria and its surrounding areas. So I did that, and frankly I'd never worked on anything at that scale at the time, and also just maps in general are quite difficult things. So that piece was something that, when I look back on it now, there's things I really enjoy about it, but at the time I was very much so unpleased with that work. And I think that's important, through doing, some small art shows like that, and just through my online presence, I wouldn't even say marketing, but just having a presence online, I ended up having some companies reach out to me in order to facilitate some sort of collaboration. In this case here that you can see, I worked with a shop in Chicago, which is kind of this high-end fashion boutique called Notre Shop, and I created this kind of marionette style, graphic that utilized their logo and also kind of my, skeletal imagery, which at the time a lot of people were saying was quite synonymous with my work, which I won't agree with or disagree with. And you can see also some of the font that I used for the internal tags and for all the other kind of branding and things associated with the collection launch. This is another one of those collaborations. On the left, that's actually a hand-painted version of, or, adorned version of one of the hats that released. So it didn't actually look like that. They just simply had the text and the visual images. And this was for a collaboration with a store called Four Horsemen, and hence why I've written down the Four Horsemen's name and these kind of arrows piercing through them. This one was quite a fun one, and it led to some people, following the hype, if you will, and even one time this person who, frankly, I don't really know who they are or their name or anything, but I suppose they came to one of my shows and purchased one of my drawings at some point, and they came up to me one time when I was at work and just said, "Hey, you're Billy Jackson. I got this tattooed on me," and that was a very surreal moment for me because, one, the fact that someone knew what I was doing and had cared enough to put this thing on their body, was even looking at it now is just a trip. And this, I feel like, was pretty powerful for me because I could kind of see, oh man, like what I'm doing isn't just worthless or pointless, and it actually may affect other people in a positive way. And for me, that just helped solidify my purpose, I suppose. And at the same time of all this, I was thinking about art and I was having art shows, and I think it was only common for me to start to kind of deeply explore the different realms of art, and that be art history primarily. And so these are some artists here. I won't name all of them, but some artists that were in particular very important to me. We have Vivian Mayer, Basquiat, Chris Burden, Mark Rothko, and these people, I think, to me, represented the idea of ideas, frankly. And some of these artists, I really enjoy all of their artwork. Some of them I like just a singular artwork, and some of them I just like who they are as a person, and their artwork is really secondary. But all of these people here, including many, many more, were all very inspirational to me when it comes to thinking about art history. But at the same time, I also felt a connection to these people that were kind of the outsiders of art history, and who were, in my mind, these extremely prolific, creative people who are very profoundly impactful, but yet were kind of not paid attention to by the supposed art history timeline. And once again, I won't go into all of these people here, but some of these people, if not all of these people here, have made a very profound impact on my life and the way that I think about visual culture and the way that I think about the art world. So I think it's only natural, after thinking about artwork and creating artwork independently on my own, that I stepped back into academia and started to pursue artwork, I guess, at a more higher level. These artworks here are going to be some plaster sculpture, some plaster works that I've created. On the left-hand side, we have this kind of dog shape, and on the right-hand side, it's a chess set. Going to school I found to be quite impactful for me. I was able to learn mediums such as drawing, but I was also able to kind of reject mediums and explore them further, to the point where in these images here you can see I actually presented videos as my final project for drawing, which at the time I was very nervous about because I thought, oh man, if you look at this point blank, it's a video, and it's a video sized hole shape, and it's trying to go into a drawing sized hole, and but I felt like it was important for me to show it, and frankly I felt proud of the work. And when it came to critique, the work was very well received, and it stemmed this kind of question and this idea of like, is it a drawing, is it a video, is it both, is it a sculpture, something different? And the idea that the way you utilize a medium and how it could kind of transform what the medium itself is became very apparent in this moment and in this class, and I think was pretty integral to the work that I'm making nowadays. This is kind of a behind the scenes of how some of those images and my further exploration with that way of making images kind of happened. You can see on the left hand side there's me Halebos, and you can see the image that it's being referenced, and that's kind of being overlaid onto this physical paper. As you can see, there's the actual pen there, and then the drawing, the pen's black, and then the black part of the paper was then chroma keyed out to remove and to show the digital realm that could be explored with a physical device. And I found this way of exploring and creating very eye-opening to me, because it allowed me to interface between these two things that like completely reject each other and are completely opposed to one another, and I became this kind of bridge between the physical world and body and the digital world and the digital body. And so this was what I would consider to be the first true digital realist works, where I was truly interfacing these two completely alien continents, if you will, creating a way for things to traverse. And in some ways, I suppose, mediating the relics that were left behind from this process. Here you can just see roughly what that process kind of looks like. For this one, I was doing a metal etching, and I was recording gameplay of my GameCube, and then I was interfacing that into the broadcasting software, and then overlaying it onto the bronze plate. And it ended up being that the final result of this image was a print, a singular paper print. But still, I feel like because of the process and the culmination and the source imagery, ends up still being inherently a digital realist work. Because I suppose ultimately my premier way of deciding if something is digital realist or not is if it's equally reliant on the digital realm and the physical realm. And if one of those two cease to exist, then whatever this digital realist artwork would then cease to exist as well. This is one of my projects, which is called Neverspoon, and this is probably one of my most proud pieces that I've ever created. This here is a composition of sequential images, and in some ways kind of an endurance type of artwork. There's 4 of these images, and the artwork itself is actually not complete yet at this point. And the whole idea of this work was to question the idea of random number generation, which is how luck is determined inside of a video game. You can think of it as a simple dice roll. And what I was doing was I was creating a series of identical artworks while simultaneously testing random number generation. And I was hoping for, at one point, to have the luck or the random number become the one that I chose during that instant. And then therefore that image in my mind would be a masterpiece. So my idea was to do a series of these images, and if I end up getting lucky and beating the random number generation, that I would have simply presented just the one singular image. And then if I was not successful, and if I was quote-unquote unlucky, then I would show the culmination of every one of the failures together as the masterpiece. I suppose. Here's a larger version of one of those images, in which you can see that red parallel bar there is the health bar of a boss that takes roughly 15 minutes to kill each time, which meant that I had 15 minutes of investment time to do the boss. And then I have 2 minutes of inactivity in which I wouldn't be punished for being inactive. And those 2 minutes were where I would actually create the drawing itself. And then that drawing came from a source drawing, I suppose. And that source drawing was supposed to be the manifestation of what I was looking to acquire. So here you can see some of the work, or if not all of the work, in the Digital Realist initial series. You can see all the Neverspoon images up top there, some other kind of images as well, and some sculptures. And, singularly, each one of these artworks are an artwork in and of itself, but ultimately what I was thinking about with this work was this culmination of information, or this collective of ideas, and this kind of modular nature, and this kind of inherently uncontrollable or unpin downable way of them manifesting. So in some senses too, these two compositions, these two different arrangements of my Digital Realism series, to me just represent the kind of infinite nature of both the digital and the physical realm, in my opinion. These here I'm quite proud of. These were, I suppose now in hindsight, I realize they're, indexable traces or relics of the event itself. But at the time, I was just thinking about this as a way for me to kind of verify and have people afterwards be able to go back and recall. So I modeled it after a receipt, or this kind of transaction using minutes. And on the receipt, I've included each one of the artworks and the title of each one of the artworks that was included in the overall series. It looks like there it says there's 23 items, so I guess there was 23 works in the Digital Realism series. And then on the left there, you can see this kind of red line, which during private showings to family and friends of this collection, I actually went through one by one and just made sure that each one of the artworks was seen and recognized, similar to how they kind of reference your receipt at like a Costco or something when you're leaving. These images here are called Python 1K, Python 1000, if you will. And each one of these images comes from a different fork of that original Python script. And the original curiosity in creating this original script was that I wanted to kind of see what a truly random image would be. And I thought, a JPEG is this technical thing. It's an image, but it's really ones and zeros. So I thought, how can I compile ones and zeros into the format of an image without representing anything visual at all? And the idea wasn't for it to be abstracted. The idea was for it to be non-visual. And the image on the bottom right there, which is very, very dense and pixelated, where it looks almost like TV static, that's the first fork of the Python 1K, the 1000 1K standing for 1000 pixels by 1000 pixels. And in some of these other later variants, you can see, for some of them, they use only 4 pixels, for example. Also, the purple image I should mention is a fork in which, once I started to kind of fork the code, and for anyone that's not familiar, forking code just means to copy it and to kind of take it into another direction while remaining the initial code intact. So for the purple one there, for example, I limited some of the colors that it was able to select when going through the process of selecting each pixel. So that way I could kind of control, or try to control, I suppose, the tone of the final image. Here you can see just a little bit of the script. Some of the images down below there Some of the code, which is a very simple code, frankly, all I needed to learn was, um, well, I needed to learn some things, obviously, but not nearly as intimidating as I think people make it seem. And then you can see the Windows PowerShell there. That's kind of the terminal, and you can see how I kind of actually was producing the images by using basically a prompt in the terminal there. And probably the most important work for that series is this one here that's called Information Highway. And it's just a simple wood block that I had carved into with a chisel and used a drill to kind of bore these holes. And I stuck a few cables into it and basically just wanted to explore cable management, which is very much so a concept in computing and personal computing, and even gamer culture, if you will. And I wanted to explore this wire management or cable management in a way that could potentially express emotions or motion, or even create something entirely different. And this work was the only thing that I was able to make at the time. However, in my mind, as soon as I saw what I was making during the process of this, I kind of knew immediately like what it was missing and what it needed to gain, I suppose. So I spent the next several months, this was during the summertime, and I would create these kind of cardboard box versions of what I wanted, and I'd take these pre-existing forms and I would cut out with X-Actos or however else I would cut out different keystones, if you will, or different ports, and I would find all these different thrifted wires that I would find in all these different stores and and things, and I would lay them out in ways that I thought was interesting. The blue stuff you can see on the background, that's vinyl wrapping, and I was using to cover the surface. But still, it wasn't what I wanted. My idea for these works was that they could all be kind of displayed in this gallery kind of setting, and these different wires or components could actually be interconnecting each other. And that was something that was very interesting to me because it turned these kind of singular artworks into this modular body of artworks, which was exactly what I was exploring in my previous works. And this was kind of a way for me to basically infinitely represent, I suppose, my own self, whether that be, my digital experiences or my physical experiences, or even just my ideas. So this is another rendering that I had done of kind of how I imagined these artworks to be when you go up to them in person. Maybe there's a gallery space that doesn't, it's not suited for this kind of engulfing nature that you see here. But maybe, there's something more subtle, right? So I was looking at that and exploring that kind of idea. And to do all of this, I needed to kind of understand how to use wires as a medium, which certainly wires have been used, in sculpting before, but the wires seem to be viewed as just a wire, as opposed to, I felt like each of these different wires had this symbolism and this emotional connection to each one. So I went through and painstakingly researched pretty much all the different cables and connectors and different protocols, which is kind of the languages, I suppose, of data transfer and other types of transfer throughout cables. And I researched all those and kind of put them into these overarching categories so I could kind of see, audio, power, visual, network, data, and I could kind of understand all these things. And then from that point, the idea was to then add these kind of very factually referenceable indexes, I suppose, to each wire that I could then use to represent my subject. And on the right hand side, you can see here, this is kind of a little bit of a brain map that I created as kind of part of a process as to how I would maybe go about creating the abstractions. Some of this ended up being utilized. However, once I ended up putting the idea into motion, this structure kind of crumbled. However, each one of the individual elements within the structure still remained, but just, I suppose, in a different order, in a different manifestation. And so this was one of the first ever mock-ups that I had created. And at this point, for simplicity, I decided to focus on just two types of wires, which was USB data transfer or power transfer, and then RJ45, and that is going to be a Ethernet connection or an internet connection, or like the tunnel in which the internet travels down. So this was a mock-up that I created with Vector Artworks of my first ever composition. This composition here was based off of the original material that I had of steel that I wanted to use. And so here you can see each one of the different components that I had to then go through and 3D print and design for each one of these specific holes. And I think there were 63 parts here in total, and this was a massive undertaking which took many hours. And it did also involve me plasma cutting the actual holes itself to then go through and photographically reconstruct them in exact dimensions digitally on my CAD software that I could then go through and create the 3D models with. That would then be seeded into those holes. That would be then the keystones in which the wires would interconnect with. And saying it out loud here, it sounds maybe more complicated than I think it is. However, my process is very much so one thing at a time. Okay, work on this part and then work on this part. So never really felt overwhelmed with all the amount of work. However, upon completing it, I realized I need to think differently. So here you can see the different compositions that I had created. All of these compositions stemmed from a singular sentence that I kind of reduced from this other original kind of idea. And then what I was going to do is take that sentence and then kind of explore that sentence in this kind of abstract way. And the way that I could do that with efficiency and also to kind of make it feel very computerized was to use WaterJet. So the WaterJet process is highly accurate. So I was able to create identical sized holes, which allowed me the capabilities of just designing these kind of one size fits all or one size fits most pieces. And then those pieces could just be mounted into realistically most, if not all, of the compositions that I was creating. So this way I could work with the WaterJet company and figure out how to cut the steel. In the meantime, I was simultaneously 3D printing and building up an army of all these different keystones that I could use in the actual works itself, which really helped me kind of maximize efficiency in doing these two things in parallel. And this is, I think it was my midterm critique at the time, but this was when I was really exploring augmented reality. Virtual reality is something that I have been familiar with for, at this point, at the point of this image taken, for quite some time now. And but this was my first chance at using augmented reality. So what I did was I created each one of the compositions, or a lot of the compositions that I was working with, and then I would create them in 3D models. I would import those 3D models into this software in my AR headset or my VR headset, and then I was able to put them onto the wall and to key them onto the wall, so I could then walk around in the space and see how the different wires would interact between the different things, or how different colors would maybe make the piece read. And this I found to be very, very eye-opening as far as creating this modular design. And it also kind of made me realize too that when going through and creating these works that I maybe need to think about this kind of origin form, if you will, or this kind of original layout, in which every time it's interconnected with other pieces, it would then kind of deviate from. On the right hand side there you can see the prototype that I had created out of metal, and I actually drew the virtual wires on top of it to kind of see how it would look on the actual sculpture that was already fabricated. Here you can see some of the custom 3D printed wires that I had created. They all have these kind of nylon sheathings on them, and they're all terminated for the most part to standards that are very universal, I suppose, within North America for this kind of low voltage IT type of work. So for me, that was kind of important, was to include the materiality of these actual cables and these kind of connection points, if you will, and the fact that they were real but not in any sort of use or didn't have any sort of function, to me was important. So here you can see the rear of one of the works, where it's completely hollow because these works are non-functioning. It's more supposed to be about the aesthetics of wires and using them as an abstract form rather than having them actually do any sort of function. The idea of them alluding to a function, to me, is more interesting. And so you can see on the left hand side where I've put all these mounted pieces in, and I've used epoxy to kind of add them all in. And I've also secured a battery pack for this specific piece with LED lights. That's kind of representational of the RGB lights that the gaming community is so kind of familiar with, or obsessed with, if you will. On the right hand side, you can kind of see me roughly trying to figure out what colors and different compositions that I wanted for the specific work once I had them all printed out. You can also see too how even while creating these uniform designs, there were still going to be artworks that would require a very specific 3D model piece to be added into that. And these were what I would call outliers. So for all of the works, I would usually create one or two outliers, and those ones would have to be constructed by hand once the design had been submitted to the WaterJet. And then also those pieces tend to be the ones that were the most difficult to fit into the WaterJet holes, just because the tolerances were so insanely tight. And 3D printing technology is quite accurate, but not that accurate when you're working on these millimeter scales. So this is kind of the part of the process that I was not so much expecting, but I had to make a lot of wires. So many wires. Way too many. So fortunate for me, I had my my cat Max there with me for a lot of it, to keep me kind of entertained and going, which was fantastic. But ultimately, this took quite a toll on my body. My hands were very, very sore, and also my sleep schedule got pretty ruined. The image on the right I included because that was actually an image, I think, from about 11 in the morning, which had been, at that point, a 24-hour session of sitting in that chair without moving, watching movie after movie after movie, just constantly making these wires for like 30 hours. And to me, that was kind of important because, my initial idea with this works, or some of my initial intrigue was like, oh, I get to see myself as this robot or as this computerized being. And then by doing so, I ended up becoming quite robotic in the process of making all these wires. In the time that I had during the semester, those are the works that I was able to create. And this is them obviously in a composition or an arrangement in the gallery itself. And here's a couple of the images of them in their origin form. This one's called The World Rubs Against Itself. This one is called Corrosive Humor. This one's a smaller one. This one is 10 by 10 by 1. This one is 20 by 20 by 2. And then last but not least, actually I think I have one more after this. This one here is called An Ideal Ideology. And this one was, I suppose, kind of my ode to minimal artwork, or kind of trying to minimize the compositions as much as possible. On the other ones that I was working on, they ended up becoming quite painterly and expressive, and some of them have rust on them and astroturf and these different materials. So this one was just supposed to be metal, paint, wires, and then I also included the RGB and the resin-filled tube, which is symbolizing water cooling, which is popular in personal computing. And so I wanted to kind of take all these elements and to kind of take them into a composition and use them aesthetically, I suppose. And then this is a kind of a work that's currently in process. And this is a representation of a digital environment, a city called Lumbridge. And my idea with this one was that I was going to kind of take the city of Lumbridge and abstract it into these kind of, into this different kind of form and into this wire kind of form. And then once I had the piece actually cut, I then kind of thought, oh, this might be interesting to then put that digital environment back into this now abstracted matrix of design, if you will. And that abstracted matrix forced me to then move around this digital environment and to shift it and to bend it to a point where it almost doesn't make sense anymore, as far as like geographics go, and accuracy of location. However, that was just kind of what was required based on now the needs of this physical thing. And for me, that kind of constant digital, physical, add to it, break it down, add to it again, break it down again, this kind of constant back and forth to me is very interesting. And that's why this is, I think, potentially going to be one of the strongest pieces, in my opinion, for the whole series. But I guess I'll have to wait and see once I'm kind of completed them, which I still have a few to go. So thank you very much for taking the time. I know this talk was a little bit longer than expected, but I do really appreciate that. You guys were able to pay attention for this long, and thank you very much. I look forward to hopefully sharing what I do in the future with you again.